Happy Monday. Welcome into a fresh week of Daily Faceoff live, streaming live on the Daily Faceoff YouTube, where we're looking for your inbox questions for later on. Drop those in. The show, as always, is brought to you by Bet365. Download the app today. Use the promo code NATION. Whatever the moment, it's never ordinary at Bet365. Tyler Uremchuk and Frank Saravalli with you. And Frank, out in Philly, what a sports weekend. You watch your Birds win, but also you were in attendance for the Cutter Gauthier return.
No, I actually wasn't in attendance for that, but I was there for the Eagles game. And also some big news today. The Flyers are getting a new arena opening in 2031. So kind of a big development in the South Philly sports complex this weekend.
I saw you tweet out the gritty and the duck thing, and I just assumed you were in the building for that one. But we're going to
I just had to make a good dad joke on a Saturday night.
It was solid. We'll have Felix Sicard on in a little bit. He's from Crash the Pond. He's going to talk about that Gauthier return. Just quickly, Frank, what did you make of it from your perspective?
I thought it was everything that a game like that should be. It was intense. The Flyers fans were hungry. They were into a game really and packed the building for the first time in what feels like a decade. And that's kind of what Flyers hockey has always been. And they mauled their opponent. And I thought that when you added all those things up, that's what an NHL regular season game should be. That's the poster child for it.
Yeah, I think that's fair. It's good to have those kind of nights in the middle of the season that get everyone's juices flowing. We'll touch on that in a little bit. It's also mid-season awards week for us here on the show. Today's topic is the Norris. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but the poll's up now over in our YouTube, so you can have your say on who you'd vote for at the halfway point of the season. We got deadline talk as well, but Frank, first, let's kick things off with a little bit of talk about the Western Conference. Today's show is going to be a little East heavy with our Eastern objectives, but when you look at the Central, it's turning into a fascinating division because I don't think anyone ever wants to write off the Colorado Avalanche, even though they're fourth right there. They could definitely go on a run and make a push for that top spot. The gap between 4 and 5 is actually the same as the gap between a playoff spot in the East and dead last. That's how significant this division is kind of split into the haves and the have-nots. And as you look right now, like Winnipeg, 6 wins in their last 10 points in 8 of those games. Minnesota, 7-3. Dallas, 8-1-1. Colorado points in 8 of 10. No one's given in with these big 4.
No, and they shouldn't. And yeah, would it surprise me at all if Colorado was able to storm back toward the end and finish in first or second place in this division? No. I was looking for or searching for a word this morning to try and add some definition to what I think the East and West are shaping up like. And the phrase that I use is that the West and the standings are just so much more defined than the East. And I think that part is accurate, that you've got 7 teams essentially in the West that I think are surefire, write it in Sharpie today, Stanley Cup playoff teams. That 8th team, I feel pretty good about Vancouver and the spot that they're in. I think that they're going to be, if they can get any luck in the health department, a much better team in the second half and should try and find some consistency there. But this Central Division, I mean, it's going to be an absolute slugfest just trying to get to the Western Conference Final. And that's to say nothing of when you look at the Pacific because, oh, well, the Vegas Golden Knights, they're only the best team in the league so far this year. It's daunting trying to come up with a list or an order, a pecking order of how you think this Western Conference is going to shape up.
Another really fun exercise is like if you could hand pick the playoff matchups between these 8, what would be the most entertaining combination of them? Because I think Minnesota, Colorado could be an absolute bloodbath if they were to get there. Winnipeg, Dallas would be like a Hellebuck versus Ottinger, but then would that just be a bunch of like 3-1 hockey games for probably a 7-game series? Edmonton, LA, that might be fun in round 1, but also Edmonton, Vancouver for a second straight season, that got spicy. Like every combination you kind of do is a really interesting one.
What about Colorado Vegas, a rematch of that West final from a few years ago? That was electric. I mean, that could still be a possibility if somehow the Jets were to pass the Golden Knights and Colorado remains in that wild card spot. That's what you'd see in round 1.
Yeah, so in the West, again, like they're probably not going to be all that interesting of a playoff race, although Calgary is technically ahead of Vancouver. If you sort by points percentage, it's like a fraction. So maybe that 8th spot could become up for grabs versus in the East. I mean, let's maybe turn our attention there, Frank. The deadline's going to be fascinating because it honestly looks like out of the 16 teams, you can squint and say all of them probably believe they can go on some sort of a run here in the second half. There's certainly no one who right now is waving the white flag, being like, hey, we're selling off everything on our roster. And that also complicates things for the big guns, the teams that want to be buyers, because it totally shifts the market. So let's start with some of those big guns, Frank. And the first team I want to ask you about is the Toronto Maple Leafs, where you talk about depth. I mean, when you look at their kind of scoring rankings and their leaderboard, it's the big six, their top six forwards, and then it falls right off. It's like Nick Robertson is next on the list for goals. So you have reinvent the third line as their top objective.
Yeah, I think that's the goal for Brad Treliving and his staff heading into this. It probably starts with getting a special third line center that you feel like can provide some versatility and potentially, if at all possible, some experience as well. That'd be a good fit. But I mean, I don't think the Leafs are immune either to changing out some wingers as well. That bottom six, I think, needs to be more competitive, and that's probably one big way to do it is to push everyone down a notch and bring in some new pieces. Now, assets, cap space, all those things are going to be hugely important. I don't know exactly how much surgery the Leafs are going to be able to do. Do you take a bigger swing on a center and then maybe not be able to do as much on the wing, or do you try and tackle it all at once? It's going to be an interesting proposition, but I think that's the clear goal and should be the stated goal for the Leafs moving forward.
Yeah, I mean, that is totally fair. No one's ever doubted the high-end talent, although it is interesting to sit here and talk about, okay, nibble around the edges, get a good third line. Come playoff time, it is about those big guns finding a way to continue to be productive, because they've done kind of every deadline approach you can think of in the Austin Matthews, Mitch Marner, William Nylander era. They've gone all in, they've sat on the sidelines, and none of it's really clicked. Another team in their division that I think is just fascinating is the Boston Bruins, because they have players who are on your trade targets board, yet they also have just a very clearly defined need in terms of a number one center. Is it fair to say that for Don Sweeney and company, it's like, hey, either take the big swing and get your guy or sit on your hands a little bit?
Yeah, that's kind of how I would look at it, because there's not really much that bringing in a second or third line guy is going to help you. Maybe it could give you a boost in the short term, but I don't know that it would do much to change how people view the Boston Bruins in the grand scheme of things, which is they're a team that so desperately needs that number one center. And it's never been more clear than these last few weeks. Pavel Zacha, he's a fine player, a really good player, but he's not a number one center. And Elias Lindholm is a solid number two center in today's NHL. But after paying him $54.2 million in the summer, the Boston Bruins have realized that he's not a number one center. So they're kind of right back at where they were. And, you can make the Don Sweeney or Don Quixote joke about whether or not this is, his long quest where they're staring at windmills trying to figure out who's a number one center in today's NHL. It's also easier said than done. So they took a swing at trying to bring in someone like Lindholm on the free agent market. It hasn't worked. He clearly looks to me like a guy who has lost a step, and they're in the same position that they were last year. Now, a competitive team and in the playoffs, obviously their standing is a lot different this year than last year. That was a surefire playoff team. They've got work to do to get there, but the need remains the same.
Yeah, and Josh asks a question, does Boston have the assets to go after a Pettersson? Or, as you touched on the DFO rundown this morning, maybe the better fit is JT Miller. But what makes that potential deal interesting, Frank, is that, Boston or Vancouver probably doesn't want a high-end prospect and 2 picks. They want something to help them win.
Yeah, and that's why it's difficult to try and look at them as true trade partners unless Boston is sending one of their defensemen across the continent that really moves the needle for the Canucks, which I'm not sure who that piece is. And given some of their contractual status is also not really clear either. The Canucks need a puck mover. The Bruins need a center. Is there potentially a fit there? I guess you could dream one up, but I don't know that one necessarily readily available comes to mind.
A team that's interesting is the Carolina Hurricanes. We've talked a lot on this show over the last number of years since we've been doing it about how the Carolina mindset and approach has always been, hey, just keep getting to the dance, and eventually you're going to catch lightning in a bottle and go on a run. Last year, they veered off of that a little bit. I thought it was a good trade at the time, the one they made for Jake Gensel, but that was really one of the few times they've pushed some chips into the middle and gotten the big piece. What do you think they're going to do this time around?
The amazing thing about the Gensel trade is they didn't really have to give up a ton to get him either.
Yeah.
Just a second round pick and some, 8th best prospect in your organization. That's a worthy gamble any year, I would say. This year, I think a lot of people have been saying, oh, well, the Hurricanes are going to go out and get a goalie. They probably only have enough assets and or cap space to do one thing at this deadline. It could still be to get a goalie, but Freddie Anderson's on his way back. Dustin Tokarski stabilized things kind of for the meantime. Pyotr Kochetkov is there, of course. I'm not sold right now that they're still going to go after a goalie. I'm thinking that they're probably going to be looking at a skilled forward to add that could maybe help that team when it comes to the postseason and putting the puck in the back of the net where it's been a little bit more of a challenge. So look for the Hurricanes to go after a skilled forward if Freddie Anderson comes back and is in a spot where he's contributing and his game is back, which every time he's come back from injury, there's been no question about him being one of the better goalies in the league. The question has always been, can he stay upright?
Yeah, and that is always, like you said, the big question, and it's hurt them in the past couple of seasons. Let's now talk about kind of the mush that exists in the East, Frank, and let's start with a team. No one has changed how people view them more than the Detroit Red Wings over the last number of weeks here. 7 wins in a row now. They are right in the thick of it in the playoff picture. If they were to win their game in hand, they're tied with Columbus for the last playoff spot. You have their top need as PK help.
Yeah, look at their penalty killing here. 69.1%. Nice. 31st in the league. It's abundantly obvious that for this team that probably shouldn't be in like the uppercase B buyer category because their roster's flawed. They need so much help on defense. I don't know that Steve Yzerman could possibly do enough surgery this in-season trade deadline period to really vault that team into a different position. They've played like a better team, definitely more swagger. But if you were to just take half of the penalty kill goals that they've given up so far this year, power play goals against, that's like 7 or 8 fewer goals against, which in the first half of the season probably equates to conservatively 2 wins, maybe 3 if you really get aggressive. That's 2 to 3 wins is the difference between the Red Wings being in and out of the playoffs. So if it's a small lowercase addition that the Red Wings should be making, it's a structure thing with the coaching change, yes, but also bring in a defined penalty killer that could really help change the fortunes of that team on the PK.
3-4 wins, they'd be ahead of Tampa Bay if they had 3 more wins, which is crazy to think. Again, speaks to how tight it is. Another team in that division who cooled off for a little bit, but certainly had themselves an impressive weekend with back-to-back wins is the Ottawa Senators. My take on the Sens is that Steve Staios has to reward that room. It's been so long without playoff hockey there. This group has been pushing and pushing. Even if you got to overpay, I'd say Steve Staios needs to add something.
Yeah, and it seems like it would be on the back end. Look, it's been a tough year with health-wise. You saw Jacob Bernard-Docker just go out. Artem Zub has missed time. They are in a spot where they need another impact defenseman. And that was the talk coming out of Ottawa this weekend as Steve Staios addressed the media. Nick Jensen has been great for this team. I think I totally saw that trade the wrong way. And Jacob Chychrun has been awesome in Washington with the goals that he's produced, but they could use one more impact defenseman, sort of like a Jensen, if they could get their hands on one to help stabilize that team. And in the meantime, just hope and pray and wish that Linus Ullmark gets back as soon as possible, because if he was back, my guess is they probably would have really gone a long way in solidifying that playoff spot.
Yeah, and that's a really good point as well. They currently sit a point back of Columbus, 4 back of Tampa Bay. Last team I wanted to talk about is the Pittsburgh Penguins, Frank. 18 wins in 45 games, but they have, as you'd say, milk, squirt, squirt. They've picked up those loser points along the way and stayed in the hunt. You have it as enjoy the ride here. I would say to Kyle Dubas, just don't do anything dumb.
Yeah, that's another way to say the same thing, I think, which is you shouldn't be a buyer. I think this Penguins team, we've seen enough sample size to know that they're probably not a cup contender. Even if they get in, they're not a real threat to do damage. Could they get in? For sure. Could they be willed into the playoffs by Sidney Crosby? Yes, it'd be a hell of a story. That said, I don't know that they should be committing any more future assets to it. And beyond that, they don't really have a ton to sell. You could sell Marcus Pettersson if you wanted to, and I don't think anyone would bat an eye if you did. But to the same point, the Pens have worked hard this year, and you should at least reward them by keeping or hanging on to what you've got. Could you get something for Drew O'Connor on the 4th line? Maybe. Something of real substance or value to you? Probably not. So I'm thinking just hold the line if you're the Pittsburgh Penguins and just hang on and see if you could sneak in. That way you're not committed either way, good or bad, in terms of future assets.
Yeah, I think that's a totally fair approach for them to have here. And I think, honestly, Penguins fans would probably agree with you in that sense, too. I don't think there's too many who are sitting there going, come on, keep pushing in and go get a big rental or something. Like, it doesn't make sense.
Kind of like the Steelers. Like, they were a playoff team, but
Zing. All right. Before we get to our big segment, Frank, let's kick off our midseason awards talk with a conversation about the Norris. And I guess I'll just start with this, maybe a little buy or sell for you. Is it a 3-horse race or is it maybe even a 2-horse race for the Norris?
It's a 3-horse race. And I'm really curious as we take a look at the candidates, Pat, who would you cross off this list when you shade it when asking that question, saying it's a 2-horse race?
Okay, so here's kind of the exercise I went through earlier today. You look at a guy like Zach Werenski, averaging 26-33, first in the NHL, leads his team in scoring, leads his team in game-winning goals. You look at everything Quinn Hughes has done on that Canucks blue line and how important he is to Vancouver, and I go, well, those are the two guys. And then I kind of sat there and went, well, no, I'm not voting on which defenseman is most important to his team. I'm voting on who the best defenseman is. And Cale Makar is not as important to his team as Werenski is to Columbus and as Hughes is to Vancouver, but he might be the best defenseman. So when I first did this, and we're going to have an article go up at Daily Faceoff where a bunch of our writers and staff are voting on these awards. And I wrote out my awards for the first time and went, Makar's number 3 because it goes Hughes, Werenski, then him. And then I had to think of the definition of the award. It's best defenseman. And I think Cale Makar's been the best defenseman, but my mind's in a pretzel trying to decipher between these three.
Yeah, my brain hurts after listening to you explain that. I'm still not entirely sure what message you were trying to send. You're trying to tell me that you think Cale Makar is the best defenseman?
I think so, but also he's like the least important to his team, and that's where.
But that's not what the award is. That's what the Hart Trophy is for, and I think Werenski has a really strong case to be in that conversation. Werenski's had an unbelievable year. Like, he has vaulted himself into the level that beyond what he's been paid at. And he's been really so good, the engine for that Blue Jackets team. That said, I'd probably, if I were casting a ballot today, would be in the exact order that it's in on your screen, left to right. Probably still Hughes, Makar, and Werenski. But the fact that Werenski's even in the conversation speaks to the season he's had.
Yeah, he's been unbelievable. And I mean, we had someone in the replies to our poll on Twitter say, if Quinn Hughes is a genuine Hart Trophy candidate, does that not just mean he's the best defenseman in the NHL? And that, again, got my brain turning of like, I don't know if those two things are mutually exclusive.
I would agree.
Yeah. It's an interesting one. Again, I'm fascinated to see how the votes kind of come out, not just on our poll, but also when we do the big group staff exercise on dailyfaceoff.com. Let's continue along with the show and get to our big segment for the day. It is the All 32, and it's brought to you by Charm Diamond Centers, where you can get a custom ring built and delivered in less than 4 weeks. Also, you can apply for the Charm Diamond Flexity card today and get approved for no interest financing on your purchase in minutes. For more information, go to charmdiamondcenters.com. Excited to welcome in Felix Sicard from Crash the Pond. He covers the Anaheim Ducks. And let's start with one of the big stories from this weekend. Frank kind of gave us the Philly take on how that crowd treated Cutter Gauthier on his way back into town. But how did you think Gauthier and the Ducks handled that?
Well, the Ducks certainly did not handle it very well at all. That was an embarrassing performance, a shellacking at the hands of the home team. I thought Cutter Gauthier was actually one of the Ducks' better players, which is admittedly a subterranean bar in this context, but he managed to clear it. I thought that he was one of the few players who managed to get any sort of offensive zone time. But yeah, just a night to forget for the Ducks, I think is a fair way to put it.
Yeah, also probably a night, though, that Cutter Gauthier will never forget. Did we learn anything about him? Like, I came away from that game watching, and yeah, I guess, when you talk about that environment and all that goes into it, I also just kind of felt like he backed away or at times was a little bit meek. I know you mentioned his play was fine, but with all the other extracurriculars, did you feel like we learned anything?
From an extracurricular standpoint, I don't think we really did. I feel like there was a concerted effort by him and maybe even the team to just kind of stay out of everything, just keep your head above water, don't engage, don't chirp back at Travis Konechny, although I don't know if that actually was a successful attempt given how much Konechny was chirping. But yeah, I think that was probably the goal. I think that from that perspective, he probably met it. We didn't have any big flare-ups involving him, but I thought his on-ice play was fine. You're right, though. We didn't really learn anything, but I think the goal might have been to not learn anything about Cutter Gauthier in this game.
Yeah, I can see that. Fair. So when it comes to the trade itself, Jamie Drysdale obviously scores, and you hear the chants, Jamie's better. It doesn't mean anything today that Jamie Drysdale scored a goal in the head-to-head matchup between these two teams. But if you were to revisit this trade, a year on, and we're still learning a lot about Gauthier's game and what he might project to be as an NHL player, how do you think the Ducks feel about this deal?
I think they probably feel great. I mean, if you compare the two players and especially the positional need, Jamie Drysdale was always a little bit of a luxury item for the Ducks. They have so many young defensemen. Even right now, they're having a hard time getting all their young defensemen in the lineup. Now, some of that is self-inflicted, but they have even more guys on the way with Tristan Luneau down in the AHL. So I think Jamie Drysdale was always a little bit of a guy that they could stand to lose, essentially. And so I think bringing in a Cutter Gauthier who's been really good. The production hasn't been there, but from a 5-on-5 perspective, I think he's played really well. So I think they feel good. I can't speak for the Flyers' perspective. I haven't watched Jamie Drysdale a ton. Wish him nothing but the best. But I think it's worked out pretty well for the Ducks.
I wanted to go kind of bigger picture now with you. I thought you had an interesting tweet over the weekend about Greg Cronin, and I'll read it for the people who are watching the show or listening to it as a pod. You said, if Greg Cronin's mandate is to make the Ducks a competitive team, that doesn't seem to be happening. If his mandate is to develop the kids, that doesn't seem to be happening. And you said, so what's left? Is that kind of the next natural step here, is that this Ducks team needs a coaching change?
I think so. And it pains me to say it because Greg Cronin is not even 2 years into his tenure, but the Ducks are at an interesting inflection point because I think there's this perception of them as a team that's still deep into a rebuild that's kind of like in the San Jose Sharks tier. And I would push back on that because I think all of their main young pieces are on the roster. They have veteran players. So what's left? The time is now to start improving, basically to be like what the Montreal Canadiens are doing right now, is to show tangible improvement. And there's really only two ways to judge a quote-unquote rebuilding team is, are you getting better? Or are your young players getting better? And right now, this team has actually taken a step back. They're one of the worst 5-on-5 teams in the league. And there's some young players that are really struggling. So I'm not really sure what Greg Cronin is adding to this mix. And so I think a coaching change is needed.
Sounds like a dumb question, but didn't we know this toward the end of last year? Like nothing really has changed between now and then.
Well, I think you're not wrong, but I think last year it was the first year. It was kind of a let's just get adjusted. The team the expectations were lower, and some young players truly did have better seasons. I thought that Leo Carlsson was great as a rookie. Pavel Mintyukov was great as a rookie. Mason McTavish scored 19 goals. So there were signs of at least some positive momentum. It's just that all of those things, or almost all of those things, have completely withered away.
Is maybe the one bright spot, and I don't know that you even call him a young player anymore at 24, but Jackson Lacombe, and has he sort of had a bit of a breakout year? Is that fair to say?
I think it's 100% fair to say. He's been fantastic. He's arguably been the Ducks' best defenseman in the last 10 to 15 games. Just, yes, there's the point production, but just his involvement offensively, his kind of maturation defensively, I think that it's all been there. And yeah, he's 24, so this is the time where you would really expect a young defenseman to take that big next step. But to his credit, he's doing it. And now a guy who maybe we were talking about as being a potential trade piece to go and get a more established forward, now it's like, well, how do you trade this guy? He seems like an integral part of the future.
As we get closer to the deadline here, they locked up Frank Vatrano, and now the pending UFA forwards, they got Fabry, Brock McGinn, who's on IR right now. I guess maybe a Brian Dumoulin is a pending UFA they can move. Do you think it'll just be the pending UFAs that kind of go out, or do you think Pat Verbeek does something a little bit bigger? Maybe it's John Gibson, maybe it's Trevor Zegras if he's healthy.
Well, every year we talk about John Gibson, and every year it doesn't happen. So this year I'm just kind of sidestepping it. Maybe it'll happen because the winds seem to be a little stronger. They're blowing a little harder lately, but I have no clue. I don't know. That's just what people seem to be saying. Insane.
Yeah,
yeah. That's why
I was going to ask you about Gibson. His numbers are better, and obviously he's taken he's played a lot better this year. But if the Ducks are quote unquote asking a lot for John Gibson, are they not seeing the forest through the trees?
Well, I think that there's no need for them to trade him. He's playing really well. Lucas Dostal is playing really well. They're a team that's trying to take the next step forward. So having a great goalie tandem would seem to work towards that end. So why not ask for a lot, I guess is what I would answer to your question. But
doesn't he want out of there though? Like, I mean, isn't that's been the premise the whole time, is that he'd like to go to a team that has a chance to win?
And if that is the premise, then yes, him playing well and asking for a lot might not work towards that end. But as far as who they might trade, I think Dumoulin really stands out just because of the logjam they have on the back end. If they want all their kids to play, which Pat Verbeek has said he wants guys to play, then Dumoulin seems like an easy piece to flip. And Robbie Fabry, I just don't see any way that they bring him back, that they extend him. It just doesn't make sense. I'm not the biggest fan of his game, so maybe I'm biased, but those are the two guys that I think are pretty obvious. And then Brock McGinn, I just don't know who would even take him at this point because he just can't stay healthy. So yeah, it's kind of a mixed bag.
Yeah, it could end up being maybe a little bit of a quiet deadline there, and we'll see how the rest of the season plays out in Anaheim. Felix, really appreciate your time, man. Thanks for popping on and doing this.
Thank you, guys. Thanks for having me.
Find him on Twitter at Felix_Sicard. You can find his work at Crash the Pond. Frank, let's get into our poll question and our hashtag AskDFO inbox question. They're both brought to you by Dominion Lending. Is your mortgage up for renewal here in 2025? You can lock in the best rates by speaking with one of their mortgage experts. Visit dominionlending.ca. Let's start with the poll question, Frank. The votes are in for the Norris. Quinn Hughes got 35% of the votes on YouTube, 33% of the votes on Twitter, but him and Cale Makar, Makar actually got the edge there by 0.6%. It is razor thin between those two.
Yeah, it's interesting though, because then you take a look in our chat and Zach Werenski finished second over Cale Makar. So it's what this would tell me, looking at all three of these players bunched so closely, like there's not really a lot separating them. This might be one of the more interesting races that we see this year.
Yeah, it'll be fascinating. Speaking of the Columbus Blue Jackets, Troy dropped in and asked DFO, since we're talking about Eastern objectives, Frank, he said, seemingly Don Waddell's considering buying at the deadline if CBG are in the hunt. Who do you realistically think they could go get?
That's a great question. I don't have the answer. And I don't know. I guess if what you're buying is there for the long term, then I guess I could see it making sense. But in the here and now, the best time to do surgery on your team is in the off season. And that's the tougher part that I see Columbus really kind of throwing their chips in to say, hey, let's do this now.
Yeah, that's fair. No one in the NHL has more cap space than the Columbus Blue Jackets, which also could make them maybe an interesting third-party broker team as we head closer to the deadline. Maybe they could do a little bit of both, get some assets for keeping some money, and then maybe use those assets to add around the edges. Let's get to our daily bets for our friends at Bet365. Download the app today. Use the promo code NATION. Whatever the moment, it's never ordinary at Bet365. Got a couple of plays for you today, including this straight bet. I kind of look at some of these average teams like a Philadelphia is, and I kind of like fading them coming off a win, because the reason they're stuck in the mud in average is because they don't string together a lot of victories. So even though Philly's at home, they've actually struggled at home this year, 9-12 straight up. You look at Florida, they're a very good road team at 13-8. Florida coming off a loss, Philly coming off a win. I like Florida to get right. Don't trust Philly to get back-to-back wins. Give me Florida on the puck line at +140, and a shot prop for tonight as well out in Edmonton. They're taking on the Kings. Leon Draisaitl, 3+ shots on goal. He had nailed this in 4 straight, then missed in their game against Chicago. He loves playing against the LA Kings. He traditionally dominates them. I like him to pick up 3+ shots on goal as the Oilers return home. And that brings us to garbage time. Frank, an interesting kind of press conference over the weekend. Daniel Sprong back down in Coachella Valley after clearing waivers, and he's having success. He's scoring goals, and he had this to say after his 2-goal performance the other day.
That is here is one to help the young guys. You know, it's a young team, and I've been a young guy before, and you know, like try to lead by example and try to help in little things. And for myself, I think just I want to prove that I don't belong here. You know, I think over my last 2 years in the NHL, I've kind of speak for itself.
Frank, let me ask you, fair or foul? Daniel Sprong saying, I want to prove I don't belong here. There were some people online saying, don't talk down about the AHL if you're down there. But what did you make of Sprong saying that?
No, I think he's right. I don't even think that he needs to prove it. I don't think he belongs in the AHL. He scored close to 40 goals the previous 2 seasons, 21 and 18. That's a guy that's a competent NHLer, yet it's the rest of his game. Like, think about it. He was coming off of an 18-goal, 43-point season last year for the Detroit Red Wings, lingered on the free agent market for 20 days, and then signed for less than $1 million. Teams view him as an empty calorie point getter who doesn't really do a lot else to help your team. And that may all be true, but where do the 18 goals and 21 goals and 43 points and 45 points, where does that come from? Like, then he goes to the AHL and dominates the way that he has. He's right. He doesn't belong there. He doesn't need to prove it. It's just that I don't know why other teams, particularly some struggling teams, why wouldn't you be adding a guy that can give you 20 goal potential for free 99?
It really is quite confusing. Again, like back-to-back years, like you said, where he has good goal-scoring seasons, then just can't find a home the next year. It's puzzling, and you're right. There are some teams still in the mix. Like, if I was Calgary, I'd be calling about that guy because you don't have Connor Zary for the next little bit. I'm not saying Daniel Sprong's a long-term fit.
You don't even need to call. You could have got him for free on waivers, and they still didn't pick him. Like, there's no call. Like, no call necessary. I'm not saying good. I'm just saying there's a reason why so many teams are passing on him. They're just
it's puzzling. All right, there you go. That is a wrap on a Monday edition of the show. We're going to continue our midseason awards for the rest of the week. Stephen Ellis is going to swing by tomorrow. Carter Hutton, John Goins, all the usual suspects going to be popping by throughout the week. That's why you should be hitting subscribe on the Daily Faceoff YouTube. Enjoy the slate of Monday games, and we'll chat with you again tomorrow at noon Eastern. What's up, hockey fans? If you enjoyed that video, then you're going to want to hit the subscribe button to not miss any of our content, from daily live shows with Frank Saravalli to analysis from former NHLers to exclusive interviews with some of the biggest names in the hockey world on Frankly Speaking. You're going to want to hit that subscribe button and stay up to date with everything going on in the hockey world.